these were things that I'm quite sure that do exist in history and that I find very likely to exist. Other things I'm not so sure, and they depend on how you understand them. And one of them is progress. And progress as an idea is particularly important to modern thinking, particularly to Western modern thinking. And it's very important for this kind of historical thinking where you think we come from a dark past, but we move to a bright future. But it does not have to relate to this strict philosophy of history. You can also think, well, I don't believe in any law governing history, but still, I would say that having universal suffrage and having the possibility for women and non-whites to vote, that is progress. And that's an argument you can make without believing that we are just like all going down this great path. But then we have to think, what would progress be? And one of the first things that we might think of is science and technology. And here you can ask yourself, well, when is there progress and how do we see if there's progress? You can ask, is progress as soon as we have better gadgets, so that we have today's phones that are better than the phones from 10 or 20 years ago? And I would say they are better, so that you can say this is progress, but is this really what we talk about when we talk about progress? I don't know. You might argue it, but it cannot be everything. You can also say, well, there's more knowledge now than there was 500 years ago. We know more about how the stars move. We know more about how things on Earth move and so on. And you can say, well, that's scientific progress. Or you can say, well, progress is not the stuff we know and we don't just amass knowledge, but it's a rationalization of the way that we gather knowledge in the sciences. So now we have scientific methods. We have what was a major innovation is the experimental methods, so that we design experiments to test certain hypotheses, and you can say, well, that we now structure knowledge this way, this is the real progress, not only the stuff that we learn from it. You can also discuss progress in the economy, which is closer to our subject, of course, and there you could, for example, argue, well, if productivity is higher, then we are more progressive. So on the same land, the same people produce twice the amount of crops, then you would say, well, they are more productive, and this was obviously some progress, as long as it depends on them making something different and not just the weather changing to the better. Or you could say, well, economy is more progressive if there is more differentiation, saying we moved from a society where maybe not every person, but maybe every household, basically they all did the same task, they all grew their own produce, they all baked maybe their own bread, they all did everything to make sure that they can exist, to a society where everyone has specialized tasks, so baking bread and growing crops and so on, they are now performed by different people. And in addition to that, we also have certain tasks that we wouldn't have even dreamed of a couple of hundred years ago, like, let's say, a stockbroker or marketing manager. And you can say, well, this differentiation is progress, and maybe it even relates to higher productivity. And you can argue this way, but again, how is one thing more progressive, and does more progressive also mean better? I don't know, you could argue. If we talk about progress, we also have to talk about the military, because in the development of societies on a grand scale, it is always important which society is able to enforce their will on other societies if they choose to try to do so. And here we can also ask, what's progress in the military? Is more military might progress? If we argue this way, we would, for example, have to argue that the Mongols were more progressive than the Chinese, than the Islamic countries, than the European countries that were conquered by the Mongols. And you can very well make this case. You can also argue, well, that's not really progress, that's just like a certain thing, like they had better horses and some tactics, and that was not true progress. You could also argue that way, but what is progress then? Is having better weapons more progress, or is having a more effective military organization, like having a standing army of professional soldiers that learn certain tactics and are drilled in a certain way. Is this progress? It's not really sure, but it's sure if we think about progress in history, we also have to think about the military. And then you can also think about politics, and here it becomes really difficult to define what progress means. Because first, you could also argue a similar way that I argued for the other things before, namely meaning, okay, that if there's more strength, then it's better and more progressive. So you could argue that a stronger central power makes a state more progressive in this sense, because then it might be more likely to withstand conquest or attempts of conquest from other societies. But we really think that a strong central power is progress, and measured against what? Measured against like a federal democracy? Probably few of us would say that a strong king is more progressive than a federal state with democracy. Or is it progress vis-a-vis all a great number of very small kingdoms? Then you might argue this way, but is it progress? I don't know. You could also say, well, more progressive government is more effective, meaning produces better outcomes with fewer resources. Or you could say, and this is then the opposite of strong central power, that more subsidiarity is progress. So if local questions are decided on a local level and regional questions on a regional level, and only national questions are decided on a national level, you could argue, well, this is a very progressive idea. But what is the measure here? Or you could argue, well, that more democracy is progress or more liberty is progress, which I guess many in this class would probably argue. But why so? What is the basis here? I'm not saying they're not, but you'd have to make the case. Then it becomes even more difficult when you think about society. When is a society progressive or progressed further? Is it if there's more rationality in the society, so more decisions are made by reasonable decision making and not by dogma? Is this progress? Or is, again, more differentiation progress, so that we have all those different roles in society and they are differentiated, there are many of them, and everyone only has to take one at a time? Is this progress, or is this just something that happened? Or is a more progressive society a happier society? Or is a more progressive society a more equal society? And probably many again here in this class would make the last case about more equality, meaning progress. But then you probably would have to argue that tribal societies a couple of millennia ago were more progressive, and tribal societies today still are more progressive than Western industrial societies, because if you look at economic equality, at least, it's far bigger in tribal societies than it is in modern industrial societies. And you can finally look, and now it becomes really difficult, at progress in culture. And this, of course, is a very risky discourse where you say, well, our culture is more progressive than the culture of the others, and this is a difficult path you could take. But if you think about progress, you also have to think about this, because if you think of science and technology and of politics and society, they are all connected to certain cultural ideas and concepts. So you might also have to think of this, and then you might also argue, well, that rationalization and differentiation are progress. I'm not sure, but what I want to tell you here is not what progress is. What I want to show you here is that progress is a very difficult concept, and it might seem self-evident at first glance, but the longer you look at it, the more difficult it gets. So I'm not sure if there is such a thing as progress in history. I'm quite sure that there is no such thing as progress as a straight line leading from a dark past to a bright future, because much too horrible things happen right now that did not happen a couple of years ago. So I don't believe in this notion of progress. However, and I think probably many of you also, do believe that we can judge that something is better, and there are possibilities for learning, and then you can also name this progress without having this philosophy of history. And one way we might think of this is what has been called the ratchet effect. And the ratchet is a mechanical device that you see operating here, and it's sort of a gear wheel and some sort of hook. And this hook ensures that the gear wheel can only turn into one direction. And so it's kind of what Honecker and Bishop said. It's forward ever, backward never. But it's not because some immutable law of anything, but because something new comes into the world, and then we don't go back to the old anymore. And you can argue that there are these kind of things in history, and there are two different ways that you could think about it. If you are very, very optimistic about humanity and society, you could say, well, if there's a new thing and every reasonable person on the world agrees that new thing is better, then we will use the new thing and not use the old thing. Let's think of television screens or computer screens. We used to have the old cathode ray tube screens that were very big and heavy and did not have very good quality, and it was kind of tiring for the eyes to look at them even. And now you have modern flat screen displays which are better in probably any measure that you could think of, except maybe for physics teachers who have more fun explaining the old TV screens. So you could still say every reasonable person would agree that the new is better than the old, and even if physics teachers might have some nostalgia for the old displays, that's not a reasonable objection. So in technology you might sometimes argue this way. But when it comes to social structure, it almost never happens that everyone agrees that the new is better, because there's always some vested interest in the past, and typically with social innovations, there are always winners and losers. And many of the things that we take as self-evident or natural or absolutely good these days, could only come into being and remain in being and become dominant by struggle and by overpowering those that were against it. Like modern ways of production, the modern economy, the modern state, all this was enforced against those who just thought the old ways were better, and in a way most of them were right to some extent, because for them the old way was working better. So when the modern territorial state was created, there were a lot of losers and a lot was lost. When the modern working day was created, it was suffering for those who had to get used to working certain hours. And all these things, you might say they are innovations that make things better in some way, but typically social change always happens by struggle and strife and one group overpowering other groups, and this is how these things come to being. Yet there might still be this kind of ratchet effect, and here once again one could argue that military power might be an important variable, because I don't know if it's hard to argue that modern territorial states are normatively better than city-states per se, but one thing we can definitely say is that they were better at organizing an effective capitalist economy and mounting an effective military, which is why they remained on the world, and the city-states pretty much disappeared from most of the world. So we can say there is a kind of ratchet effect, but it's not necessarily something that has to do with reason or consent, but something that has to do with one group overpowering other groups. One last thing we have to discuss in this general part on history and difference is the way we are representing difference or otherness. Because if we hold that there is difference in history and different societies have different histories and different developments, there's always the challenge to represent these different histories in the difference. And there are, I would say, 7 dangers in this. The first danger is to ignore the existence or relevance of others. And we have this for much of modern European history, where there were books written on the history of mankind or the history of humanity, and those were typically histories that maybe started with the ancient Egypt, then the ancient Greek, the ancient Romans, maybe some Christianity, and then there were the Dark Ages, and then modern Europe evolved. And this was supposed to be a history of mankind, but obviously it was only a certain history of a certain Europe. And this is ignoring that there are others of relevance, but there are also attempts to deny the relevance of others by saying, well, and I'm only paraphrasing here, paraphrasing German philosopher Hegel here, saying that Africans, they don't have history, so if we discuss world history, we don't have to account for Africa. And this is, of course, a grave danger, and if we think there is difference in history, then if we want to present the history of mankind, the history of humanity and the world, then we actually have to do so. The second danger is ignoring the difference of others or seeing the others as identical to the self. And then you would say, well, I do tell the history of mankind, and then I say, well, those who lived in the Americas or in China or in Australia, they basically have the same kind of development as we do, and we all are humans, so we're all the same. And then you're just disregarding the fact that there is actual difference, and that you, in order to represent a history of humanity or of international political economy, you actually have to think about the way other societies did economy in other times. The third danger is seeing others as incomplete versions of the self. And this is a way of thinking that typically related to this idea of history as a progressive line starting in the past and going to the future, because then these thinkers who think this way typically think of their own society as being ahead, and then they see difference in the world. And the only way to explain difference in this kind of mindset is saying, well, then if the others are different, then I just like a little bit backwards on this scale of development, and we're up here and they're still down here. And then you can only see other societies as some defective or incomplete version of your own. Fourth danger is representing others as some sort of contrast to the self. And this happens in different ways. You could say the two most important and maybe two most dangerous ways are, on the one hand, just like portraying the others as everything you don't want to be. And this is also something that happened strongly in modern Europe, particularly in racist discourses. Then these discourses basically described European beings as everything they thought as desirable, as strong, rational, manly creatures, and everyone else was just like the opposite, like the dark mirror image of that. So we had irrational, hysteric, effeminate others. And this is one way of representing the other as a contrast to the self. There's also another version of it where you romanticize the other. This also quite often happens. So if there are some thinkers who think, well, here in our society something is going quite bad, and I want to demonstrate how bad this is. This often happens if you show another example where everything is way better and way different, and where people handle this much better, and then you just like say, well, look at how great people in, I don't know, China or Sweden are handling everything. And this could, of course, be fine if you actually represent what's happening in these other countries. If you, however, only use these other countries as a blank screen on which you project your own wishes in order to convince your compatriots that they should change, then you're just abusing the representation of others to make your case internally. Fifth danger is representing the others as homogeneous. I already talked about this. So it's fine and it's important to say that the history of the economy of the Inca Empire worked differently than the economy of medieval Europe, and there are important points to be made here. But this does not mean that there was one Inca economy and one European economy, and that they were the same all the time, and that they were homogeneous, which is mostly not the case. The sixth danger is representing the others as absolutely different. So as something that has nothing to do with you, and in the extreme cases, this can mean defining them out of humanity and denying the common humanity. In the less extreme cases, it might just mean ignoring all interactions between self and others, and just not accounting for these the commonalities that different societies might have. The last and seventh danger I want to talk about is the danger of forgetting that there are many forgotten histories that can never be fully retrieved. If we want to tell the history of a certain society at a certain time, we of course need sources. We need some kind of evidence. In the best case, these are reliable written sources where we had some authors from the time we're talking about who were giving full accounts on events, and these are authors that we can rely on, that they at least try to tell the truth. And the more of these sources that we have, the better our picture of this society might be. However, not all societies keep these kind of records, and even if they keep these kind of records, they are not always available to us today anymore. And this general problem becomes even worse if there were conquerors who destroyed much of the evidence that we had. And many European colonizers did exactly this. Because particularly for conquerors who are also missionaries, who want to convince the conquered of their own belief system, of their creed, in this case of Christianity, these conquerors try to destroy all remnants of the old ways that should be overcome. And this is what happened in much of the Americas, in Africa when European colonizers came there. So there are many things that we cannot know of the past, and that's just the way it is, and we have to live with this, and it cannot be changed. But the important lesson here is that just the fact that we don't know the stuff that happened there does not mean that the stuff did not happen. So the mere fact that we don't know great Inca poets maybe today does not mean that there weren't any. It just means we don't know that right now. Of course, we should neither fantasize about all other societies and ascribe all kinds of wonders to them, but we must be aware of the fact that there are irretrievable histories that we don't know of and that still existed.